Moses, the great leader of the Israelites, standing on the edge of the Promised Land, looking over a nation he helped free from slavery. A nation that had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, shaped by the stories of their ancestors and their connection to the land. This is where we begin, a nation rooted in farming, herding, and harvesting. But let's rewind and look at Moses' journey and why he, of all people, would be the one to write down the foundational books of the Bible, communicating in a language his people would understand, agricultural language. Born into a time of political oppression, Moses was a Hebrew child saved from the decree of Pharaoh, adopted into the royal family of Egypt. This is where his story begins. Moses grew up in the luxury of the Egyptian palace, learning the ways of royalty, administration, and education. Acts 7:22 tells us that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Imagine this. Moses was not just a nomad or an ordinary Hebrew. He was well versed in literature, diplomacy, and the law of Egypt. He could have lived his life as an Egyptian prince, but God had other plans. Despite his upbringing in Egypt, Moses had a heart for his people, and when he fled to Midian, his journey as a leader and prophet truly began. Why is this important? Because Moses' unique background prepared him for the incredible task of leading the Israelites and, more significantly, writing the first 5 books of the Bible. But what's most interesting is the language Moses used to communicate God's laws and stories to the Israelites. He didn't speak to them as an Egyptian scholar. He spoke their language, the language of the land, the soil, and the harvest. This was the language they understood. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into why Moses used agricultural language when writing Genesis through Deuteronomy, how he could write stories from Genesis even though he was born in Exodus, and why these books were vital not only in preserving God's laws, but also in proving his divine authority to the elders of Israel. You won't want to miss this. Stick with us, especially for the last sections, because many people overlook just how much God used Moses to shape his divine plan for the nation of Israel. And don't forget, comment with your thoughts and subscribe to Flash Bible Stories so you don't miss out on our future deep dives into biblical history. Why Moses used agricultural language. The Israelites were a people of the land. They were not like the Egyptians, whose wealth and power were built on a complex urban civilization. The Israelites were farmers and herders. Their lives revolved around the seasons, the rain, the soil, and the harvest. They measured their wealth in flocks, their success in the yield of their crops, and their survival in the fertility of the land. When Moses communicated God's laws and promises, he used metaphors that spoke directly to the daily lives of these people. From Genesis to Deuteronomy, the language of agriculture is everywhere. Why? Because this was the reality of the Israelites. To them, God's blessings and curses weren't just spiritual, they were tied to the land. This is why Moses continually used agricultural language to describe God's relationship with his people. Let's start in Genesis. Genesis 1:11 says, "Then God said, 'Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds.'" From the very beginning of the Bible, the imagery is agricultural. Moses uses the creation of vegetation as the first step in preparing the earth for humanity. It wasn't just about creating plants, it was about establishing a relationship between humanity and the land. This would have made perfect sense to the Israelites, who saw their survival tied to the cycles of sowing and reaping. Then in Genesis 2:15, we read, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." Again, Moses emphasizes humanity's role as caretakers of the land. The idea of working the land, of tending to it and reaping its benefits was something the Israelites knew well. And as Moses continues to recount the history of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, their connection to the land remains central. Abraham was promised a land flowing with milk and honey, and this promise was passed down to his descendants. This theme continues throughout Moses' writings. When Moses describes the covenant God made with Israel, he often ties it to the land. For example, in Exodus 23:10 through 11, Moses gives the command, "For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused." This isn't just a rule about farming. It's a spiritual principle tied to the rhythm of life that the Israelites understood. The land wasn't just dirt, it was their lifeline. God's blessings were tied to the productivity of the land, and his curses were tied to its barrenness. When Moses spoke of obedience and faithfulness to God, he used language that resonated with the people's experience. In Leviticus 26:3-5, Moses writes, "If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees their fruit. Your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting, and you will eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land." This wasn't an abstract promise, it was a tangible reality. The people depended on the rain and the harvest to survive, and Moses used these physical blessings to illustrate spiritual truths. God was promising more than just material provision. He was promising to be their provider and protector in every way. On the flip side, Moses also used agricultural language to describe the consequences of disobedience. In Deuteronomy 28:22-24, Moses warns, "The Lord will strike you with wasting disease, with fever and inflammation, with scorching heat and drought, with blight and mildew, which will plague you until you perish. The sky over your head will be bronze, the ground beneath you iron. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust and powder. It will come down from the skies until you are destroyed." These curses weren't just distant threats. They were direct attacks on the people's source of survival. Without rain, without crops, without healthy land, the Israelites would starve. Moses used what they knew, their reliance on the land, to drive home the seriousness of obeying God. The same applies to how Moses communicates about the promised blessings of the promised land. In Deuteronomy 8:7-9, he describes it as a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing. These are the promises that would have excited and motivated a people who had wandered the desert for 40 years, where food and water were scarce. How Moses wrote Genesis now, you might be wondering, how could Moses write about events that happened before he was born? After all, Moses wasn't alive during the creation of the world, the flood, or even the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So how did Moses know these stories in such great detail that he could write them down in Genesis? The answer lies in a combination of oral tradition and divine revelation. Oral tradition was the backbone of historical memory in ancient cultures, especially among the Israelites. The stories of creation, the patriarchs, and God's promises to his people were passed down through generations. Fathers would tell their sons about God's covenant with Abraham. Mothers would recount the faithfulness of God to Isaac and Jacob. These stories were more than just tales. They were the identity of the Israelite people. They were the foundation of their faith, the reminder of their special relationship with God. Moses, being a Hebrew and growing up among his people, would have been familiar with these stories. Even though he spent his early years in Pharaoh's palace, Moses knew his heritage. He would have heard the stories of creation, the flood, and the promises God made to Abraham. But Moses didn't rely solely on what he heard. God himself gave Moses revelation, guiding him as he wrote the book of Genesis. In Exodus 33:11 it says, "The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend." This intimate relationship between God and Moses ensured that when Moses wrote, he wasn't just recording human memory, he was writing under divine inspiration. When Moses wrote the creation account in Genesis, he wasn't just relying on ancient stories, he was revealing the truth that God had shown him. God filled in the gaps and provided deeper insight that went beyond oral tradition. For example, the intricate details of the 6 days of creation, the fall of man in Genesis 3, and the specific covenants God made with Noah and Abraham, these are accounts that only someone inspired by God could write. Moses wasn't alive during these times, but through divine revelation, he was able to accurately record the foundational events of human history. But why was Moses writing all of this down? Was it just to keep a historical record? While the preservation of God's laws and the history of Israel was certainly part of it, there was another reason Moses wrote the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, to prove to the elders of Israel that he was truly sent by God. The elders of Israel were the spiritual leaders and guardians of the people. They knew the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They had passed down these stories from generation to generation, but now Moses was claiming to be God's chosen leader, sent to deliver Israel from Egypt and lead them to the promised land. How would the elders know that Moses was truly speaking on God's behalf? By writing down the stories of Genesis, Moses was essentially validating his authority. The stories he recorded were the same stories that the elders had been teaching. By writing them down in a way that was consistent with what the elders knew, Moses was showing that he wasn't inventing a new religion or leading the people astray. He was confirming the ancient faith of their forefathers. This is why, throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Moses continually refers back to the promises God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He reminds the people that God's plan for Israel didn't start with them. It started long ago with the covenant made with Abraham. In Exodus 6:8, God says, "I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord." Moses was grounding his leadership in the unchanging promises of God. Even the laws that Moses gave were tied to the covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 17:9-14, God commands Abraham and his descendants to be circumcised as a sign of the covenant. In Exodus 12:48, Moses reaffirms this command, stating that any foreigner who wants to partake in the Passover must first be circumcised. By reinforcing these ancient laws, Moses was showing the elders that he was not creating something new. He was continuing the covenant that God had made with their ancestors. In Deuteronomy 34:10-12 we read, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." Moses was not only a leader but a prophet, and the writings he left behind, the first 5 books of the Bible, were proof of his divine calling. The significance of Moses's books. The books that Moses wrote, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were more than just historical records. They were the foundation of Israel's identity as a nation chosen by God. These books contained the laws that would govern their society, the promises that would guide their faith, and the history that would remind them of their unique relationship with God. In Deuteronomy, 31:24-26, we read that, "After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law, from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you." Moses' writings were meant to be a witness for future generations. They were a reminder of God's faithfulness, His laws, and His promises. And for the Israelites, these writings were a lifeline. As they entered the Promised Land, they would face challenges, temptations, and enemies. The stories of their forefathers, the laws of God, and the promises of the covenant would be their guide. In Joshua 1:8, God commands Joshua, Moses' successor, to keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. The books of Moses were not just for the past, they were for the future, guiding Israel as they became a nation under God. God's purpose in Moses' life. Moses' life and writings weren't just for his time, they were for all time. Through Moses, God gave Israel a foundation that would last for generations. From the creation of the world in Genesis, to the laws given in Leviticus, to the final moments of Moses' life in Deuteronomy, we see God's hand at work, preparing his people for their future. So, why did Moses use agricultural language? Because it was the language of his people. It was the way they understood the world, the way they related to God, and the way they lived their lives. Moses, inspired by God, used the language of the land to communicate eternal truths. As we look at the life of Moses and the books he wrote, we see a man chosen by God, educated in Egypt, but deeply connected to his people. A man who spoke the language of the Israelites, who recorded their history, and who gave them the laws that would shape their future. Moses was more than a leader. He was a prophet, a teacher, and a servant of God. We've journeyed through the life of Moses and seen how God used him to write the foundational books of the Bible, how he communicated in a way the Israelites would understand, and how his writings proved his divine calling. But this is just the beginning of understanding how God worked through Moses. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Moses' life and the significance of his writings, make sure to comment below with your thoughts. Let us know how God has spoken to you through these teachings. And don't forget to subscribe to Flash Bible Stories so you never miss out on more insightful biblical lessons like this. There's so much more to discover about God's plan for his people, and we want you to be a part of it. Stay blessed.